I'm sitting at my dining table, needles and thread in hand, working on sewing my very first Rakusu. It's something I never thought I'd be doing, to be honest. Years ago, when I first got involved in Zen Buddhism, I never felt drawn to the idea of receiving a Rakusu, that symbolic bib-like garment worn during Jukai, the ceremony where you formally take refuge in the Buddha and receive the precepts. For me, it felt like one of those far-off traditions, something other people deeply connected with, but not necessarily for me. I've always had a bit of a distant relationship with the formal side of things. In fact, the only other garment I've ever received is a wagesa, a simple black band I got during my first Jukai. I folded it carefully after the ceremony and tucked it away in my sock drawer, and that's where it stayed, almost forgotten, amidst everyday life. It wasn't intentional neglect, really. In fact, it lived right alongside a few other personal treasures I keep there. A delicate moonstone bracelet from my mother, an old crucifix that belonged to a great aunt, an amber bracelet from Poland. Somehow, the wagesa found itself mixed in with these precious pieces. For a long time, I felt a strange guilt about this. Here was this sacred object meant to signify a deep commitment, and I had let it blend in with socks and dusty corners of my drawer. But as I sat down to finally start making my Rakusu, I realized something. The mix of the sacred and the mundane in my sock drawer was actually kind of perfect. Buddhism, especially Zen, is full of these contrasts. The everyday meeting the profound, the sacred touching the ordinary. And in that sense, my sock drawer wasn't such a bad home for that black band after all. As I began to explore the history of these robes, I came across the story of Shakyamuni Buddha, the one that really caught my attention. When he renounced his princely life, one of his first acts was to exchange his luxurious clothes for the simple robe of a wandering monk. Imagine that scene for a moment. He's at the edge of a river at the very break of dawn, cutting off his long hair with a sword, handing over his jewels and fine garments to his servant. In their place, he takes on a rough, worn robe from a passing deer hunter. It's such a powerful moment, this shift from wealth to simplicity, from one life to another. What struck me most was how that robe, tattered and seemingly unimportant, became something so significant. It wasn't just about putting on different clothes, it symbolized his complete transformation. And that transformation, in turn, has echoed through generations of practitioners, including me, sitting here with my Rakusu fabric and thread. This transition from the material to the spiritual is still a key part of Buddhist practice today. In receiving the robe, whether it's the kasaya or the Rakusu, we're stepping into a new way of living, a life where what the world discards, we embrace. As Dogen Zenji, the great Japanese Zen master, put it, what the world abandons, the way uses. It's a reminder that even the most ordinary, rejected things can carry the greatest significance. There's something so raw about sewing a Rakusu. The fabric, traditionally made from discarded rags, speaks to that same transformation. What once was considered waste becomes a vessel for something sacred. And the saffron color, which we often associate with beauty now, originally represented impurity, contrasting with the pristine white clothing worn by the lay people of the Buddha's time. I find myself marveling at this contrast, how something once seen as dirty or unwanted can be transformed into a symbol of spiritual purity. Sitting here, stitching the pieces together, I can't help but reflect on the symbolism of the patched nature of the Rakusu. It reminds me of an old story retold by Thich Nhat Hanh about how the Buddha once stood on a hill, looking out over the vast rice paddies, the fields neatly divided into golden patches. He turned to his disciple Ananda and said, "Wouldn't it be nice to sew our robes in the same checkered pattern?" That's what the Rakusu is, a reflection of life's many fragments, brought together in harmony. Each stitch I make feels like a small meditation. It's not just about the sewing, it's about connecting with something deeper, something timeless, and in a way, letting go of the need for perfection. Because just like life, the Rakusu isn't about being flawless. It's about being present with each piece, each thread, even when they don't align perfectly. So here I am, stitching this humble garment, feeling more connected to both the tradition and my own practice than I ever expected. It's funny how the things we once set aside can suddenly become so meaningful, isn't it? When I first began cutting the black fabric for my Rakusu, I was flooded with all kinds of emotions, many of which I didn't expect. It's strange, isn't it? How something as simple as a piece of cloth can stir up deep, almost hidden memories. I had no issue with the technical part, measuring the pieces, sewing the lines, but there was this heavy feeling I couldn't shake. It reminded me of my childhood, of standing in church, fascinated by the bright green robes of the priest, the way they seemed to glow with a kind of energy as he lifted the white wafer. Back then, I wanted to be the one up there, holding the body of Christ above my head, not just watching from the pews. But somehow that vision got tangled with this fear of the other side of things, the dark, constricted life I associated with nuns, covered in black from head to toe, everything about them muted. I didn't want that. So here I was, decades later, struggling to reconcile these old feelings with the task in front of me, sewing a Rakusu, traditionally black, a color I associated with heaviness and repression. It's funny how these thoughts creep up when you least expect them, isn't it? I tried to push them aside at first. After all, this was a different tradition, a different purpose. But still, the weight of the black fabric seemed to reflect that old aversion. I kept telling myself it was silly to hold on to these outdated associations, repeating words from Xin Xin Ming, the Faith Mind poem, to ground myself. Even slight distinctions made set earth and heaven far apart. I wanted to believe it was that simple, to just let go of the mental barriers. But after hours of cutting fabric, the feeling persisted, and I finally broke down and called my teacher. "I feel like I'm suffocating," I said, unsure how to even explain what I was feeling. "There's something about the black cloth. It feels wrong for me." My teacher, always calm and understanding, didn't miss a beat. "It's okay," he said. "Sometimes we have to go beneath the things that make us uncomfortable. You don't have to use black if it's not right for you. Try brown or gray." It felt like a permission I hadn't even known I needed. I'd been so fixated on doing things the correct way that I hadn't realized how much I was struggling with the idea of the black fabric itself. So, after spending hours meticulously cutting the pieces, I left the house, went straight to the store, and bought gray fabric instead. Part of me felt like I'd given in to some childish part of myself, but the relief I felt outweighed any lingering guilt. As I stitched together the new gray fabric, I found comfort in remembering that the history of Buddhist robes is full of adaptation and flexibility. The kasaya, the original Buddhist robe, was made from discarded rags, a mix of what had been thrown away and what was still useful. Over time, what started as a piecemeal garment became more structured, more orderly. But even then, the number of pieces used in the robe, whether 5, 7, 9, or more, has always varied depending on the tradition. There's a story that always makes me smile about how the Buddha, once during the coldest nights of the year, kept adding layers of robes until he finally determined that 3 layers were enough to stay warm. It's a wonderfully practical approach. There was no mysticism around it, just straightforward experimentation. Even in modern Zen practice, this layering of garments has persisted. There's the white juban, an undergarment, followed by the koromo, a long-sleeve black robe, and finally the kesa, the outer garment, which is often seen as the most symbolic layer. The kesa, like the Rakusu, was traditionally made from patched-together strips of fabric. And while most kesas today are solid, dark colors, their history is filled with beautiful contradictions. Some were made from luxurious brocades, sometimes even from discarded ceremonial robes or no theater costumes. It's this duality, the ragged and the opulent, the practical and the symbolic, that I find endlessly fascinating. The Rakusu, the smaller bib-like version of the kesa that I'm sewing now, has its own interesting backstory. There's a belief that it came into use during a time of persecution in China when monks had to blend into lay life. They couldn't wear their full robes, so they created the Rakusu to wear discreetly under their clothes. It became a hidden reminder of their practice, of their commitment, even when they had to move through the world like everyone else. Knowing this history, The gray fabric in my hand started to feel more fitting for me. It was still a patchwork, still a connection to tradition, but it was also my own way of honoring that tradition without getting stuck in my old fears. Just like the monks who had to hide their robes, I realized that the real essence of practice isn't in the color or the fabric itself, but in what it represents. After getting over the hurdle of the black fabric, I found myself facing a new layer of resistance. It's strange how these things sneak up on you, especially when you think you've already made peace with them. For me, it was this deep, visceral reaction to the idea of wearing anything around my neck. The thought of being constrained, of having something binding me, stirred up an unease I wasn't prepared for. It's odd because I've always known that the roots of the word religion come from religare, meaning to bind back. And I'm well aware of the links between yoga and yoke, the idea of discipline, of connection. But somehow, the physical sensation of it, the weight of something hanging from my neck, felt too much. I've never been someone who likes feeling pinned down by form, and yet I know, deep down, how essential form can be. I remember vividly the lost, drifting feeling of being pathless, without any structure to ground me. Even though it's been over 20 years since that young Thai monk first showed me how to sit cross-legged on a cushion, I still feel a sense of overwhelming relief in ritual, whether it's bowing or chanting. Sometimes, even now, tears spring to my eyes as I move through the forms, as if my body remembers what my mind forgets, the comfort of having a path to follow. But then, why this resistance? Why does the idea of the Rakusu around my neck make me want to step back? I know part of it is just me being me, clinging to my quirks. I've never been one for uniforms, and I've always had this aversion to being easily identifiable. There's something about standing out in a way that feels forced or rigid that makes me uncomfortable. And in the Zen communities I've been a part of, I've seen how the Rakusu can become a kind of badge, marking out who's in and who's not, sparking these subtle waves of envy or longing in others. It's hard to ignore that. But deeper than that, there's a more pressing question, one that tugs at me whenever I think about putting on the robe. If we're practicing to understand the oneness of all beings, why should we differentiate ourselves with outward symbols? If our true nature is formless, why express that through a form? These questions sit with me, weighing on me as I go through the motions of sewing my Rakusu. And I realize that this isn't just about my discomfort. It's about the tension between the conditional and the unconditional. That's where the act of putting on the Buddha's robe starts to take on a different meaning for me. It's no longer just a symbol of a transition, a sign of entering into a new way of life. Now it's tied to something deeper, more existential. How does the Buddha manifest in this world? Through me. The robe then becomes a question, a living, breathing inquiry into what it means to embody the teachings in this very moment, in this very life. And it's not surprising given how charged the symbol of the robe has always been in Buddhism. From legends to koans, the robe appears again and again, representing this complex relationship between the relative and the absolute. It's a particular thing we wear in a particular way, yet it points to something beyond all particularities, beyond color, shape, or even the body that wears it. It's a practice, a reminder that while we live in the world of form, we're always reaching towards the formless. This symbolism also extends to the lineage we're a part of when we put on the robe. By wearing it, we're aligning ourselves with the Buddha, with the teachers who came before and those who will come after. But what does that really mean? What is this tradition we're stepping into, and how do we carry it forward? These are questions that Dogen explored in great depth, and it's easy to get caught up in the detailed, almost obsessive way he writes about caring for the kasaya. He goes into painstaking detail about how to wash it, how to fold it, how to treat it with reverence, soaking it in fragrant water, walking around it with incense, bowing before it. And then, in the next breath, he'll say something like, "When you put on the kasaya, it's the same as when a prince ascends the throne." It's both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. A simple robe, but also a direct connection to the question, how does Buddha become Buddha? As I continue sewing my Rakusu, I realize that it's not just fabric in my hands, It's the weight of tradition, but also my own complicated feelings. Gratitude to my teacher, pride, discomfort, doubt. All of it is stitched into the cloth, layer upon layer. The pieces are arranged in a crisscross pattern, the same as they've been for centuries, but somehow, as I work, the Rakusu feels like it's opening up, expanding. It's not just a robe, it's becoming a field, a space where all of these feelings, contradictions, and questions can live.